We are born free, and we will die free. The time in between, though, that's complicated. In that time, governments, institutions, and our egos will limit our ability to find true freedom in this life. These are real stories of real people overcoming the odds, persevering in justice, and unlocking their potential. Welcome to Finding Freedom. Here's your host, John Oderman.
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Finding Freedom here on the Lions of Liberty Podcast Network. Great to be speaking with you on a Friday afternoon here. We're broadcasting live on Twitter and Rumble and YouTube at about 1 p.m. Eastern time here on June the 6th. A ton going on in the world today. Just as a note, if you're listening to this later in time, a week, 2 weeks from now, this is the day after the Donald Trump, Elon Musk blow up on Twitter. So who knows where we'll be in 2 weeks, but just to kind of put a stake in the ground so people know where we are from a timeline standpoint. I'm going to introduce my guest in a minute, but I got two real quick things I want to talk about before I do. First off, sponsor for the show, Fox & Sons Coffee. My friend Stephen Fox sources the best and freshest beans that you can get out there. A lot of great options to choose from. You can check them all out at foxn, the letter N, sons.com and get 15% off an order of $40 or more by using promo code John. Second up, by the time this show airs, our new show on the Lions of Liberty Network, our new feed, I should say, feed not within the Lions of Liberty feed, but it's standalone feed, our new show called Politics. That's politics spelled tick like the blood-sucking insect. That new feed should be live. So search on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever podcatcher you use. Check it out. Search for the Politics podcast, and we'll be talking about all of the madness happening in that spectrum. Okay, let's bring in my guest for today. It is Joseph Gradante. Joseph is the co-founder and CEO of Allio Capital, where he uses his expertise as a finance veteran and a macroeconomic strategist to help investors make decisions based on the complex interplay of elections, policy, and economics. Joseph, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, John.
Great to have you here. And, for my guests that aren't familiar with you, aren't familiar with your work, maybe haven't heard you interviewed before, if you could give just a background on yourself, sort of what makes you tick, what brought you into this investing and political realm?
Well, started out as a global macro strategist on the buy side, but really, I think just, when I got into finance, I had a degree in public policy and political science and economics. There were a lot of CFAs. And, my uncle was like, why don't you go work for the Obama administration with your background? What are you going to do here? And, but that was really, we were in this low interest rate, artificially low interest rate, I should say, environment, with Bernanke. And so it was pretty clear to me that markets were moving on geopolitics, right? Like that's what was moving markets, fiscal, monetary policy, basically the Ray Dalio framework. And so I was able to pick, asset classes and sectors better than a lot of bottom-up analysis. And so really the goal of Allio Capital is to introduce that modality, right, without people having to read a 600-page macro investment book via our, intentional behavior-led user experience in the app. So that's what Allio Capital does. And that's my background.
Okay. So in this political climate we're in now, I talked about at the top of the show, the craziness happening between Donald Trump and Elon Musk, this the breakup of the bromance, right? It's really volatile political times. We can get into tariffs and get in specifically how you see that affecting markets going forward, what kind of impacts that'll have. But just from if we zoom out from that macro standpoint, with an environment like this, where you have a president like Donald Trump, but really, I think there's a lot of uncertainty in which direction he's going to go, what's going to happen. How is that affecting markets today? How is that informing the decisions you're making and how you're investing?
Well, let me take a step back from that,
Yeah.
right? Because the goal of macro investing is to look at the macro, the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in this feud, Elon Musk is obviously disappointed about them rescinding the EV tax credits in the bill, right? But that bill is so essential to all of our prosperity. Economic freedom is a prerequisite to political freedom, just generally speaking. And so Bill Clinton said it best, it's the economy, stupid. So the goal of the big, beautiful bill, right, is to really stimulate economic growth. And I think, if that bill passes, economists are predicting between 3 and 5% GDP growth. And so a rising tide lifts all boats. And so that's obviously good for markets, right? And so that's how, we're seeing it, but we're obviously paying attention to the bill very closely because you have these, vested special interests that maybe don't want to see the administration succeed and would rather go back to, the chaos of rancid Washington, right? That really, that just keeps them in power, but has a negative, detrimental effect on the life of the average American. And so, that's that bill is really gonna determine everything over the next 6 to 9 months. And it's interesting that people like Rand Paul and Elon Musk are criticizing it because it's not about what needs to happen. It's about what can happen. Government is all about compromise. And so, you mentioned Lions Liberty Network and like libertarian principles. And so I look at somebody like Rand Paul and I think, what does this guy really believe in? He's grandstanding clearly here. To me, it's just they got to come together and they got to work as a team the same way that the left does, because the alternative here, right? If they're concerned about the debt, if they don't keep power, it's going to lead to the left getting back in power. Where if they have a good economy, they're going to get more bites at the apple, right? And the bill does cut 1.5 trillion in spending. So it's a start. It's a start in the right direction, but it's really about the big picture, because if you have a booming economy, that's likely going to be a catalyst going into 2028 and allowing them to potentially keep, the executive in the Senate. And that has massive implications for markets, right? Because if you don't get an extension and you don't get clarity on fiscal policy, as you see, how markets just get spooked over, potential tariffs. So if you get the largest tax increase in history, that's going to send markets spiraling. And so, there's a lot at stake here.
Yeah, there certainly is a lot at stake. And I think that's an interesting point you bring up where, if the bill doesn't pass, right, and we look at the midterms coming up pretty quickly, they'll be here before we know it. And if Republicans don't have a booming economy, like you put it, certainly that's going to hurt their chances of getting re-election. So I think that of course that's influencing how a lot of people vote. When you look at someone like Rand Paul or Thomas Massey or what Elon Musk is saying, from my view, this is just my perspective, I think a lot of what is causing them to grandstand, or however you want to phrase it, is what's happened with what Elon Musk brought forward with the fraud and abuse and wasteful spending that was uncovered through Doge, and none of that being codified in this bill. Now, I understand this bill is a reconciliation bill, not an appropriations bill. So really what that means is what this money has already been spent. It's kind of confusing to even think of it that way, right? But they're reconciling how this is all going to be distributed, right? I think I'm understanding that correctly. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, but on that, they are putting forth an appropriations bill to codify the Doge cuts. And right now, currently, it looks like it has about one. And I think that's important because then you can get a lot of these congressmen and senators on record, right, as to whether or not they're really serious. I just don't think the big, beautiful bill is the place for the Doge cuts. And I think it's more about the big picture, securing the board and getting the start right at this America First agenda. And if they don't get it through, because yeah, I mean, you have to understand like your reality and be aware of your surroundings. Like they do not have the benefit of the media on their side. So the media will use this as absolute fodder. And you can't give the left an inch, right? You can't give them an inch because of how dangerous they are and what they're putting forth. And so, yeah, so, with Ron Johnson and Rand Paul, it's really hard to understand how they're thinking about this, going forward, particularly, in the case of Johnson, who barely won, his election last time. It's like, I just wish they would play as a team the same way the other side does, because this is a once in a lifetime opportunity that could potentially, keep them in power for much longer beyond 28 if they get it right.
Mm-hmm. So from a macro perspective, just to talk about the Elon Musk, Donald Trump relationship, I don't know if it can be healed, but how impactful will that be? Probably, I don't think that's going to be a positive way with the markets, in a negative way with the markets going forward. If this continues, the back and forth, the really the cutting comments at each other.
It's not good, but I think, Musk has, with Tesla being into shape, he's obviously the one who's a little bit more on the defensive here. And in my opinion, being a little bit petty, the president, if he gets the bill passed, then I don't think any of this is going to matter. So that's what he has at stake is the optics of it, right? And so the perception where if they're having this spat, then I think he has a little bit, less leverage with the Senate, because if the Senate feels, they're obviously very sensitive to public opinion. So Elon Musk has a lot of fans out there, and so if some of these senators that are on the fence, it could make all the difference. So I think that's what Trump has at stake. But in the case of markets overall, I really think it comes down to that bill.
Okay. Moving on, just to talk a little bit more about your philosophy. I know you mentioned Ray Dalio before. Who are some of the people who you've learned from, who've influenced you in how you look at investing?
Well, really, Dalio's, the big guy. Obviously, my uncle Charles Gradante, started me out, on the buy side. And but in the case of Dalio, what's interesting, if you look at his best-selling book, which is Principles for Dealing with the Changing Global Order: Why Nations Succeed and Fail, which I consider to be, the Bible of macro investing. Only one chapter is actually devoted to macro investing, chapter 7. The rest of it is about looking at policy and understanding how policy and its implications for markets. When most people think about markets, they think of, bottom up, Benjamin Graham, approach to investing. But we're not in that 1990s, 1980s stock picking environment anymore. We are truly in, and Dalio refers to it, similar to a time like the 1930s, where everything, in markets is contingent on the state of geopolitics. Looking at what monetary and fiscal policy have done historically, you could really understand how asset classes are going to move and how sectors are going to move. And it just makes sense to make the investment and understanding that in terms of what it means for your financial future. Because at the end of the day, you're just one vote. You don't have any control of what's happening in Washington and what's happening with government, right? But you've worked hard to accumulate your assets, right? And so what you can do, you could protect yourself, right? And prepare yourself and even benefit from this great change that's happening right now on the world stage, the shift in global order and this, the displacement that's happening as a result of AI and the fourth leg of the Industrial Revolution.
So how do you see that playing out? And I guess maybe we'll get into tariffs now as well. So you're going to kind of take this wherever you want to, but just to kind of tee you up. So something that like I've been considering recently with this whole tariff battle is obviously a lot of the manufacturing has been moved over to Asia. We don't manufacture much here in the United States. In the coming years, obviously AI is, changing things rapidly. Automation, robots, the manufacturing landscape is going to change completely. And something that I've been thinking about, a lot of people who say, well, we'll never manufacture in the United States again. We don't have the people to do it. The only way we could do it is if we continue to import illegal immigrants to work those jobs. I kind of push back on that a little bit with the thinking that, well, I don't think it's going to be people working a lot of these jobs when we look forward in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I think it's going to be automations and robotics, and our entire manufacturing landscape is going to change. And when I look at tariffs, where I am a libertarian, but we're playing in a, it's a global landscape, right? So we have to use the tools that we have to kind of fight back against the manufacturing that we've lost. So what are your views on that dynamic? I know I just threw a ton at you, but pick up a piece
Great
of
question.
that and
phenomenal question. So I want to start though with the libertarian point, because
Mm-hmm.
there's the Murray Rothbards, right, and the Ludwig von Mises, right, but then there's also the John Stuart Mills, right, who believed in worker cooperatives, right, and had a much more, I think, because at the end of the day, the preservation of liberty, if you have monopolistic and oligopolistic competition and you don't have parity within the system, well, then our civil liberty is really protected, because if you have, right, all this disenfranchisement, displacement, that destabilizes the system.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole reason why we have, say, these radical calls for this far left totalitarian socialist is all because of this displacement. And it goes back to the tariffs and globalization, because production, right, is what creates wealth. Production comes from innovation. Innovation comes from education. So we essentially took our wealth. I mean, Ross Perot made a great libertarian argument, right? He was Trump before Trump. And so we essentially took our wealth and we sent it to this closed society, this totalitarian, and we've enriched them. And so the tariffs, to me, are a strategic negotiating tool. But, timing, because of, where we're at with AI, I don't see us becoming this booming manufacturing hub again. I think it's just about, opening up foreign markets to American business and kind of leveling the playing field and making it a bit more fair. But I think the deeper implications, right, are, the depth of the IP and just kind of making this, putting this on the global stage, having these conversations and putting China on notice, particularly, right? And it's hard to just negotiate it if you isolate China. So I think that's the strategic advantage, by saying, because other countries have taken advantage of us as well. But at the end of the day, what I think is likely the most likely outcome is that we, that we bring back some strategic manufacturing, right? Like we shouldn't be making our antibiotics in China. That doesn't make any sense. That's a national security issue, right? But I think our technology, what's gonna protect our national security, our national interest, is continuing to dominate on IP and innovation. That is part of, what makes us Americans. That's what's most important. And so I think, it's about the, the optics, if you will, like Machiavellian says, perception is power. So I think the perception here, right, it gives America this strategic negotiating tool to really let the world know that, hey, we're back in business and we're not going to be taken advantage of anymore. And I think there's still, right, the tariffs are just one policy tool. It's about the sum total of policy changes. So when you combine tariffs with deregulation, you think about how that affects commodity prices and energy, and then tax cuts, right? And so, and you look at the totality of it, right? I think it's a net benefit and a net boom for the American economy overall. And I hate to bring up the bill again, but right, I think the tariffs will look a lot better, right, if we get this bill passed, because they will be one piece of the overall administration's agenda.
Yeah, I get that. Moving forward, I was continuing on AI, because that's such a focus right now, and it's such a demand for attention, but also obviously it's a demand for energy, and that kind of leads me into my next question. As AI computing and the need for cloud computing grows, everyone's talking about the need for more data centers, which of course, in order to have all these data centers powering all this computing power, we need to have the power to do it, right? Which we don't have right now. This is coming quickly in the next 5 to 10 years. And a sector that I follow closely is the nuclear power sector, specifically small modular reactors. And I just wanted to get your input, since you're someone who is looking at it from the macro. How do you look at this need that's coming on the horizon for power? Are you looking at specifically at small modular reactors as a place where you're looking to invest? You're looking at different sectors. What's your perspective?
Well, the whole macro perspective is really not looking at things bottom up and looking at these. It's really, I mean, yeah. Once you get into a granular level, right? If these sectors are favored, then you'll look at, say, individual companies within that sector. Um, but it's about does policy favor innovation and growth in that sector, right? And obviously, there's high demand for energy, and I think that's one of the potential alternatives to meet that demand. And so I think it's viable. I wouldn't say it's the core of our focus, because what's more important to us is just looking at things from a risk perspective and having the right combination of risk on, risk off assets in a portfolio, because it's about, like, what we seek to create is elasticity in a portfolio. So you want a portfolio that's defensive but can exploit upside opportunity. And so it's really about that blend and having that chemistry, as opposed to, like, hey, we're gonna go heavy in this area because
Right.
we see it as a major growth case.
That makes a ton of sense. And speaking of policy, we saw, what was it, 2 weeks ago, Trump came out with his executive order, which at least is going to try to deregulate the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, a little bit, which I don't know if that's going to happen. That's a tough group of people to try to change. But okay, continuing on, from this macro perspective, looking at Donald Trump, second term. Obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, because there's been his teases about running for a third term, which I don't think are real. I just think he's giving the media a hard time. But when we look ahead to what comes next after Trump, a lot of people, my guest last week, Austin Peterson, was talking about, he thinks there could be a split in the Republican Party, because he doesn't think Trump is going to name a successor. And then it kind of just opens it up for the Wild West of anyone coming forward. So from that macro perspective, looking forward, if there's not a leader identified of this MAGA movement, how does that affect markets?
Well, right, that would destabilize markets, right? Because obviously markets like clarity on the fiscal front and the monetary front. First and foremost, right? Like, monetary policy is paramount, and then fiscal policy is, slightly ancillary, almost tantamount, right? But you need guidance there, and if markets don't have that, then that's a negative. As far as the GOP, I mean, it goes back to where I started. It's very frustrating, their lack of unity. I don't know if this party ever anticipated getting back in power. When you look at when they were, being led by Mitch McConnell, it was almost like they were the controlled opposition, and this the central council, if you will, to make it look like you had a choice, but there was no real choice. And then all of a sudden, Donald Trump comes along and just challenges the entire establishment and upends the entire system. Not really as a Republican or a Democrat, right? Because he's a populist, and he's very moderate. He has, obviously, like, Tulsi Gabbard and RFK. And I don't know how much the big Republican donors like that, or they go along with it just because, he's the dominant force in the party, and that's the best that you're going to get. So what I'm getting at is, I don't know if there's going to be this knee-jerk reaction once you have that vacuum created by the absence of Trump, to try to for those powers to pull back the levers. And I do think if you were to end up getting this division that Peterson's alluding to, it would come from the establishment camp, which is likely to be behind Marco Rubio, right, and the MAGA camp, which would be behind JD Vance. I do think if that battle happens, JD Vance wins it hands down, because the MAGA movement is massive. It's eclectic. It's not really Republicans. It's Republicans, Libertarians, Democrats, Independents. It's anybody who is practical and has an IQ above 110, right, is on that side of the equation usually, because they understand that everything comes down to our freedom and the economy. And without that, you don't have anything. So JD Vance, I mean, in my opinion, he's going to be the standard bearer going forward. I know he's raising a lot of money right now, and he's phenomenal in debate. And he doesn't come with some of that baggage that Trump comes from, because he's not as incendiary, and he's not as, hyperbolic, and he's not as thin-skinned. He has the statesmanship that Trump lacks. So it would be really unfortunate, though, if Trump does that and contributes to that state of affairs. I really hope that, he's just avoiding, because obviously, he's an egomaniac, right? So he doesn't want to hype JD Vance too much up now because he doesn't want to, create that attention. But I do think, once the time comes, he will hopefully name him as the viable successor.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch when that time does come and JD Vance needs to start campaigning, how Trump handles that. Because he is an egomaniac, like not wanting the spotlight to be off of him. So that'll be something to watch.
Even in his 80s, he'll still struggle to give it up.
For sure. Let's talk a little bit about Allio Capital and what you call a capital consciousness. What do you mean by that term? Can you kind of lay that out for us?
Yeah, because everything comes down, like, I don't believe in ideologies. Like the notion of Republicans and Democrats, it's like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, right? It's really about economics. Everything comes down to economics. The distribution of resources always it's going to be managed by scarcity. Scarcity is the dominant force in our existence as humans. And so the new capital conscious is people coming together around the common. And I think economics is the force to do that because economic freedom isn't just about, new multi-billion-dollar AI companies. Economic freedom, I mean, if you believe that healthcare is a right or housing is a right, that comes down to economic freedom, right? And because your government can never be the solution to anything. It has never been the solution. It's always going to be ingenuity and the private sector that's going to be a solution. So, whether it's gay marriage, whatever, you need the economy to be that force, right? And so Milton Friedman said it best, that economic freedom is a prerequisite political freedom. So at Allio Capital, our mission is to promote economic literacy and use macro investing as the catalyst to get people to sit down at the table and have a conversation about economics, regardless of their political background, because we're all Americans. And, so it stems from, I was in an Uber one night and I was having a conversation with the gentleman. This was back in, 2018. And we were talking and we were hitting it off and we agreed on everything. All right. And towards the end of the ride, it was like a 45-minute ride. I mentioned to him that I was a Trump supporter. He mentioned to me that he was a member of Rose City Antifa. And yet we agreed on 95% of things. And it's amazing how we're kept divided and kept apart when the truth is that most human beings at the core level want, the same things. And I think economics, is the subject, right, to address that. And I think people have to really come to the table around it. So that's what I mean by a new capital consciousness.
Okay. And you have a podcast too, right? Orwellian Optics.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what you're trying to accomplish with that?
Well, to get people to see through the fog, right? Because war, right? War is peace, right?
I love the name for sure.
Yeah. Well, because that's what it is. I mean, the media lies to you, particularly the legacy media. And I think you have to see beyond that. And that's why I think, if you understand economics, it's easier to see the truth and how the implications that these policies have for your daily life. I mean, I'll just give you an example, like a real far-fetched, out of left field example. You go back to the 1990s, right? And you think of music and you think of movies in the 90s and 80s and how great they were compared to today, right? Because you had this free system. And so that led to these animal spirits of innovation and freedom of expression. And so it impacted that impact that it had on our culture was profound. And we've lost a lot of that because we've lost that edge. We've lost that, that thing that really makes us unique as Americans, which is our ingenuity and our freedom. And so, the goal of the company is to get people, back to that, to understanding what really, what the lifeblood of that system is.
Not to go off on a side tangent, but why not? How much do you think that, that you're talking about freedom, and someone might argue that, well, when you're talking about music specifically as an example, you could say people have more freedom today. I mean, you can make songs and music videos using just your phone, right? So kind of the way that I see it, though, is a lot of this, it's not, the freedom is not imposed by a government. It's people sort of putting the prison on themselves. It's like their own mental prison that's keeping them in different silos because they're trying to fit into, a certain form of social media in order to hit a trend, in order to go viral, in order to become popular.
Yeah, technology, is a major variable in that equation for sure. What I'm getting at is that the culture seems to have depreciated and declined. I mean, when you think about, movements, you think of something like the hip hop movement or the punk scene or the goth
Mhm.
scene. I grew up in downtown New York City, in the East Village, and you saw all this expression everywhere. I mean, people used to go out on Thursday and end up coming home on Monday or Tuesday because they would just meet up with a clique of people, in the late 90s, and they'd hang out in the parks, and because there was more socialization, right? There was
Mhm.
more. And so technology is obviously definitely a culprit in this. But I also think, censorship, cancer culture, this corporate fascism, if you will, has really, taken away. You go to St. Mark's now and everybody looks the same. It's people in jeans and a black t-shirt, and nobody stands apart, and people are afraid to talk to each other and laugh and have conversations, with each other. And I think, and so I think that's affected our culture in a negative way. And so I think, freedom, right? And so that's what I'm getting at, the importance of freedom. And I think, you go back, the U.S. started out as, you mentioned tangents. It's okay to go off on tangents.
Yeah,
So
go for
I'm
it.
going to go off on a little one right now. The United States started out as a minimum viable product, right? That's what our Constitution, it was an experiment. It wasn't a
Mhm.
country. And so people don't understand that it was this experiment around this document that 13 different countries came around, and they didn't agree on anything, right? Except liberty, right? Should be at the heart of it. And they compromised around this concept of liberty. And so, and that led to the women's suffrage movement, right? The Civil War. These additional features got added because they were so inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment. If you look at, the writing, for the women's suffrage movement or the civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King and those speeches, they they implicate the founders and the
Mhm.
ideas that they were expressing as to why they were pursuing these other tangential movements. And so everything sprung from that. Everything that we are and everything that we have came from this idea of freedom. Steel, electricity, the combustion engine. I mean, you name it, right? The light bulb, the telephone. So today with Starlink and Tesla, right? And so this is fundamental to our DNA, this idea of freedom. It's why we're this rainbow too. I mean, there isn't any other country in the world whose population is represented by a rainbow, and that's because this idea of freedom brought everybody here to join this party. And we're going into our 250th anniversary next year, and I want the party to keep going. So that's why we're trying to promote this idea of a new capital consciousness around economics.
Yeah, let's keep the party going, make it even better. Let's get a bigger, more beautiful party,
Yes.
As Trump would say. So just to kind of zoom out here as we get towards the end of the interview, zoom out once again. We're talking macro. Outside the United States, looking globally. What kinds of other trends or international policy or wars, foreign conflicts? What types of other things are you watching closely right now?
All of the above. I mean, that's what macro
Mhm.
investing is, right? It's really looking at the global stage, policy, not just monetary policy here, but in other countries, how that affects rates and currencies. And the wars are big, right? Because if you have a supply chain that comes from that region, right, then
Mhm.
right, it's going to limit the supply. It's going to drive the price up. So the hope here though is that Trump is able to kind of broker a deal, on some of these fronts. He's already started, but I think the Ukraine Russia thing is, it's really interesting in paying attention to that to see what happens, because
Mhm.
on the backdrop of that, Russia is an ally of China. And the one potential black swan event that concerns me is if China, goes after Taiwan. Now, I think if our economy is very strong, that's not likely to happen. But I think, it's it, it's possible that China's, attempt to destabilize us, through fentanyl and other means, right, is about. I mean, you just look at the fact that under the Biden administration, the military recruitment was at an all-time low, and none of the branches of the military outside the Marines were able to make their recruitment goals. And yeah, I can go pretty deep into this, but China obviously had a vested interest into destabilizing our system. And I wonder, if that's part of that is. And so if they were to go after Taiwan, right, that could be huge on the global stage. And when Dalio talks about, things being similar to the 1930s and these popular uprisings, right? That's what he's alluding to, is that you have all this contention right now in the world, and it could potentially, if we're not careful, if we do things right, hopefully Trump's able to broker peace deals, if we're able to come together and compromise and get bills passed. But if that doesn't happen and something like that happens, and China, and Russia were to form an alliance, obviously the implications for markets would be catastrophic, and you would have a complete recalibration of the global monetary system. And so when you look at gold prices and you look at Bitcoin and you look at, de-dollarization, there's so much right now, to pay attention to on the macro front, because all this is happening before our eyes, and most people are just paying attention to media headlines and not looking behind the curtain.
Yeah, and from a macro front, speaking of the media, things have changed drastically with how people, what even the media is, right? I mean, to me, the media is X. Like, that's where I get all my news. I don't turn on Fox News or CNN or MSNBC to get news. And I think anyone under the age of, 50 probably is in that same boat, looking at that first. So the media, it's so much faster. Everything moves at so much, it's like hyperspeed media, because nothing's slowing it down. It's very decentralized.
Yeah, and that gives me hope, right? Because they can't control it. And if they can't control it, right, then that's freedom, and that's usually good for the system, and that's good for everyone, right? If voices are able to be heard. And that's why I am so grateful to Elon Musk, and I'm so disappointed with the spat, because, X is, so important, right? Because if people don't have the right information, right, then the republic can't function, because John F. Kennedy talked about this, right? So democracy is only as good as its information. So, so yeah, I think that's a major catalyst as to why we have Trump, right? And why we potentially circumnavigate what was otherwise, going to be a catastrophic outcome if we had stayed on the course that we were on, through the Obama administration and the Biden administration.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot more hope now than there was. I mean, things are a little bit tumultuous, but
yes,
in the middle of that Biden administration, things were looking pretty bleak, and Trump, very, very dark. Trump was being attacked legally, and until it got up to about maybe 6 months before the election, I thought we were going to end up with either Biden, then once they took a shot at Trump and things kind of changed. That's really was I think one of the big turning points.
Well, look at COVID, right? Look at COVID. Yeah. And that was really an eye opener for me, how people would give up their civil liberties and their freedoms so easily. It's crazy, right? Just over fear mongering. And then
you were in New York for that. And that had to be wild to see.
Well, I live in the Pacific Northwest, which is actually worse, because people here were just, going along with it without questioning. Yeah. And to this day, you still see a few stragglers that are walking around in 80-degree weather with the ultimate symbol of authoritarianism, which is the mask. And yet, so when you asked about Orwellian optics, that's kind of what we're alluding to, is that people who are walking around with the ultimate symbol of fascism refer to themselves as liberals. And, so we are living in these Orwellian times. But yeah, that was very scary. And that's the path that we were on, is a system of, fear, control, and division.
Yeah. It's crazy how fast things can change. I am optimistic for the future. It sounds like you are as well.
Yeah, very optimistic.
Yeah. So we're running out of time here, but I do want to just thank you for coming on the show. Give you a moment here to plug anything else maybe we haven't talked about, or if you want to talk again about anything else that we have.
No, check us out at alliocapital.com. Go to the App Store or Google Play, download the app, where we're live in the market, and we'd love to have you. So, John, thank you for having me.
All right, Joseph Gradante, thank you for coming on Finding Freedom. All right, guys, that is a wrap for today's show on Finding Freedom on the Lions of Liberty Network. I want to thank my guest, Joseph Gradante, for coming on the show. Hopefully you guys got something out of that. Maybe it took, if you're a libertarian listening to this, I don't think you have to agree with everything, but hopefully it took you out of your little box, your little echo chamber that you might be stuck in, to get you just to look at things from a little bit of a different perspective today. Want to do a reminder one more time before I let you go. New podcast feed coming up on the Lions of Liberty Network, the Politics Podcast. That's Ticks, spelled like the insect, Tick. and check it out. Subscribe. Tell your friends. Take your wife's phone. Subscribe on her phone. Take your mom's phone. Subscribe on her phone. Whatever you got to do to start to get this feed going. We appreciate it. And of course, we have our bonus content over at the Lions of Liberty Pride on Patreon and Locals. So check that out. And that's all I got for you this week. Without any more delay, I will be back again next week with another great episode. In the meantime, always remember to keep your head up and the fires of liberty burn